Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swamin Hite Namani.
I was waiting at the temple. Prabhupada had arrived at the airport in his, I guess, limousine or car or whatever, pulled up. And everyone was chanting. And I didn't know what to expect. I'd been chanting 16 rounds for about a week. And as soon as he got out of the car, I had a reaction that I'd never had before. I saw that it appeared that he was being projected from some other world. And I don't know how to put that into words to make the description match the actual experience, but it was though he, like in a theater when something's projected on the screen, and there's motion, but you know that it's coming from somewhere else. And that was his presence. It was unearthly. And immediately I could understand that this was my spiritual master, and this was an absolutely pure person. And I fell down on the ground and offered obeisances, although I'd never offered obeisances to anyone before. And just in my heart, I immediately accepted that this is who I've been looking for. So that was the first time. And then when he actually came into the temple, after he paid his obeisances to the deities, he walked down the center of the temple, and devotees on both sides, to the Vyasa-san, which is at the other end of the temple. And he was just glancing at everyone, just smiling, and just very like loving glances. But you know, as everyone says, I think everyone I've ever heard talk about, when Prabhupada looks at them, you just felt that he understood everything about you, and you felt completely exposed as just a foolish, person. That it seems to be a kind of almost universal experience with devotees, that they have that feeling that you had no secrets. Prabhupada could understand everything about you, essential. So that was the first time.
I was present in Sydney, and Karunda wrote a letter to all the temple presidents saying it's a matter of etiquette to invite the Guru to your temple. And Karunda said he won't come, but it's not likely that he'll come, but invite him. And Prabhupada had an itinerary which took him to Moscow, and so I duly wrote a letter saying, please come and visit Australia, and was totally shocked when the response came, I'm coming, send 2 tickets. We had no money whatsoever. I mean, we'd go out and sell back to God. A big day was $50, Paying the rent was a major achievement. And so we let it be known that we needed $3,000 for 2 tickets, and one fellow who was coming to the temple, his name was Raghunath. His later name was Raghunath when he had been initiated, and he was a Baha'i at that time. And he donated $3,000 so Prabhupada could come to the temple. And I believe at that time Prabhupada arrived with Radha Gopinath. I think Bhagavan, he came 4 times, and I may mix up the sequence and chronology, because this is many years ago. But to my recollection, he came from the big pandal in Bombay, at the Quamadan. And the deities that had been used there were Radha Gopinath. And he came with those deities, and I believe Bhagavan held them in his lap on the plane, at least one of them. Maybe Bhagavan one, Shyamasundar another, I don't know. And so they arrived in Sydney with the deities, and we had just a storefront. The famous story. Prabhupada came. The storefront was kind of interesting because it was right at a bus stop. And there was a big window. So we would have our 6 o'clock arti, or evening arti, just at the time when the commuters were waiting around to go home. And there was this big lotus flower with Radha Krishna, and of course there was still plenty of clairvoyant glass through which they could see. And we would have, the arti was like a public exhibition for 30 or 40 commuters every day. And it was in Paddington, which was a trendy area. So it was a wonderful temple. It wasn't clean. Prabhupada later said that he left the deities in Mlecha Desh. We hadn't even changed the carpet from when it had been a store. And we didn't even know the carpets themselves are dirty. And we didn't know anything about devotional service. Really, the first two devotees who had started Australia were Ballymartin and Upendra. And Upananda joined, and then I joined with Vaibhavi shortly thereafter, and then they left. One went to Fiji and one went to Hong Kong. And I was driving to the airport, and I said, well, who's going to be in charge? And I had only been living in a temple 2 weeks, and they said, well, you are. And then a few months later, Prabhupada came, and there were virtually no books at the time. There was just that old blue Bhagavad Gita with the preface by Allen Ginsberg. And to be honest with you, I couldn't understand it. I mean, later on, I think I got a good understanding of the philosophy by listening to cassettes and taking notes. But the reading of Bhagavad Gita was over my head. So Prabhupada came, and quite understandably, he was appalled at our lack of knowledge and all, but he said they were sincere. They were sincere boys and girls. He gave this, he had this initiation ceremony. It was a small storefront. But when Prabhupada came, but I have always been very good with the media. That's been one of my natural talents. So we had 3 or 4 television stations, and their cameras weren't like yours, big, you know. And they were crowding there, and the lights from the television station. And then there was 100 people in a room, which could only comfortably fit maybe 40 or 50. So Prabhupada, we had made an altar, and Prabhupada did the installation, the pratishthan. And we really got, those of us who had been around before, we'd gotten our first initiation by letter. So at this time, we were getting the first fire sacrifice, and then the second initiation Brahmin. We didn't know what a Brahmin thread was. Prabhupada said, he said, it came to the point, he said, where are the Brahmin threads? And we said, what are Brahmin threads? And there was nobody. And so Vaibhavi went downstairs, and she got string. She just got a ball of string and tied them together and brought them up. And so we had our Brahmin initiation.
People from all over America had come to see Prabhupada. There was like many initiations at that time. So they were sitting there, and Prabhupada started describing the life membership program. And he said, we have introduced this life membership program in India, in America as well. And in India, it's 1,111 rupees. And when they become a member, we give them an entire set of books. He says, and so this is a very good business. And then Prabhupada started, each time saying this, started to laugh. And each time he said this, he laughed more and more. And I noticed the devotees weren't all quite getting his humor, or knowing what was going on. A lot of the devotees were young, they had no idea of business, or some did. And Prabhupada was saying, so we give them 500 rupees of books, and we take 1,000 rupees. Very good business. And then Prabhupada laughed again. He's like exploded in laughter. Very good business. And then Prabhupada says, and they invite us to in their homes, and they feed us a feast. They give us 1,000 rupees, and we give them 500 rupees of books. He said, in this way, we are eating our way back to Godhead. Very good business. Prabhupada laughed. And then everyone cracked up. So that was my first meeting with Srila Prabhupada, this meeting of seeing his enormous humor, his wit, how he would teach with his humor, and his precise intelligence, and how he was not a businessman, but he had this highly developed side of him as a manager and an organizer.
When our small temple in Florida was closed, we moved out to Dallas, and part of the reason I was brought out there was because I was one of the only people that had any credentials, teaching credentials. And so when Prabhupada came to Dallas quite a number of times, I'm not sure the exact, either 3 or 4 times, but he used to take walks on White Rock Lake, and which was the richer section. And a famous industrialist, H.L. Hunt, had a home there on White Rock Lake. So the devotees were telling Prabhupada that we tried to go see H.L. Hunt, but he wouldn't see us. Prabhupada said, oh, he would not see you? He said, but when death comes, will he also say, I cannot see you? He says, anyway, he may say, but death will come and do its business. And then he said, anyway, what would you tell him if you were able to see him, get in to see him? What would you have said? So then they were kind of on the spot. Well, somebody said, well, maybe we would show him your books. And he said, no. So we'd tell him about the school, and Prabhupada was, no. He didn't like those answers. And finally he said, you should tell him this. You should tell him he's become a wealthy man by stealing from the earth. He was an oil tycoon. He said, by stealing from the earth, he has become wealthy. He said, and at death, he will be punished very severely for this crime. He said, this is the way you should speak to him. So then, I don't remember which devotee, they said, Prabhupada, if we speak like this to him, he'll become angry. Prabhupada said, angry? He said, if I shake my stick at a dog, he will also become angry. He said, you have to learn how to talk to this class of men. And that was it. That was his instruction.
I had him booked on a number of national television shows. There were Mike Willisey, Bob Rogers. But we'd have to travel quite a distance to get to the studios. And then they'd only give Prabhupada 5 or 10 minutes, which is, you know, I mean, that's all you give Richard Gere, for that matter. And the questions would be superficial. One time Prabhupada looked at me after an interview, and he just shook his head and he said, they do not know how to question. And I remember another time Prabhupada and I were sitting in the waiting room to go into some national TV show, and they had a little TV on in the anteroom. This is in 1971 or 70. And they had the most graphic scene of a woman being violated in the woods. I mean, it was like, I don't even think they show things like that today. And Prabhupada just, he was absolutely astounded that these kinds of things were graphically displayed on a public medium. And just he and I were in the room. Prabhupada, he looked at the whole thing. I thought he would turn away or something, but he was so incredulous. It was almost like he couldn't take his eyes away from it. He could not. And then he just turned, you know, he was looking at it, and he turned to look at me, and he just like, world, you know, the world is just going to hell like that. And he just shook his head. And he actually asked me to desist from booking him more television engagements, even though he was reaching 1 million people. They weren't asking deep enough questions, and the time was too short. And I had to call up a couple of national shows and cancel, because he would rather speak to a smaller audience but get into Krishna consciousness in depth. Now, along that theme, and I'm not sure which of those 4 visits this was, Prabhupada did go on one show called the Mike Willisey Show. Mike Willisey was a famous interviewer and host at that time, and he would always damage his guests. He was extremely cynical, acerbic, and almost no one went away from the Mike Willisey show without bleeding from several wounds. And he'd given Prabhupada a love seat, a 2-seater, and he sat, whatever, to the side. Prabhupada had a big picture of Krishna, and Prabhupada sat down closest to Mike Willisey, and he put the picture of Krishna on the seat next to him. So Mike Willisey figures, you know, this is like a, you know, this is have him for breakfast. Yeah. So he said, this is your Hindu god? And Prabhupada said, he said, no, this is God. He said, do you have any, you know, tell me whatever you'd like to about God as he's described in your scriptures. Anything you'd like to share with me about his name, fame, qualities, pastimes, feel free. Tell me what your if you're saying that this is a Hindu God, then tell me about your Christian God. As much information as you'd like to share with me and the audience. And he said he couldn't say it. He said, well, there isn't much. And Prabhupada said, well, we have all the information in our scriptures. If you're interested, we'll show you that Krishna's not a Hindu God. He's God. He fits all the qualifications, and you have to accept him. You failed. You failed to present me with a superior description of God. I have his picture right here. You have not even a word to say. So you please accept him as God right now. Mike Willesee was completely devastated. I mean, no one had ever turned him upside down like that before.
He told that story about intelligence and how his god brothers didn't want to give the credit. And so the story is about Columbus, that they said actually it was an accident that Columbus discovered America. He never intended to do it. Have you heard this story? So the other people in Spain were complaining that he shouldn't become, like royalty and glorified. That he really hadn't even intended to go there. It was actually Americus who had gone there, and this and this and this. Every way they were trying to discredit Columbus. It was brought before the Queen, and they were all there debating. So Columbus said, actually, it wasn't an accident. He says, so there was a challenge. So Columbus said, I pose a challenge. No, actually the Queen posed the challenge. He said, let it be decided, I will pose a challenge. And who can answer this challenge, they should get the credit. So she said, here is an egg, and without any extraneous devices, make the egg stand on end. So, everyone was trying to think about different ways, and somehow or other they were trying to get this egg stand on end. And Columbus was sitting there waiting for everyone to finish. So he says, now may I have my turn? And he went and boiled the egg. He tapped it on its end and stood it up. Everyone, of course, protested. But the Queen understood that Columbus was an intelligent man. And so he got the credit. So this story, of course, was told primarily by Prabhupada about his god brothers being envious of him and not wanting him to really have the credit of spreading Krishna consciousness. Like even now, people are saying it was really Lord Chaitanya. Even it's really audacious to say this. So impersonal. Although Prabhupada said this, whenever anything would happen, he said it. He would say it so humbly and meekly. It is all the mercy of Lord Chaitanya. It is all the kindness of my spiritual master. You are all simply the disciples of my spiritual master. Prabhupada would say that. And you'd know this person really has not one drop of false ego. But he knew who he was. It's amazing how this can be. It's almost impossible from any position other than pure devotional service to understand how someone could understand this.
On another occasion, on a morning walk at White Rock Lake, Prabhupada was just observing different things as he walked along. And then at one point, somebody pointed out there was a horse in a field on one of the estates running. And Prabhupada said, oh yes, horse. A horse is the most beautiful of animals. So then Satsvarup Maharaj, kind of almost like playing a straight man, said, Prabhupada, I thought a cow was the most beautiful. And Prabhupada thought that was really funny. He said, a cow? He said, a cow is not beautiful. And then Prabhupada said something to the effect that amongst the humans, amongst the women, the humans, he said, what did he say? The Jewish women are the most beautiful. Which I was kind of amazed by that. And then Satsvarup said, but Prabhupada, the black people say that they're the most beautiful. And Prabhupada said, everyone will say like that. That was it. It was just real light, but it was fun.
On another occasion, I'd booked Prabhupada 2 speaking engagements in one day. One was at the North Sydney Boys' School, which was a very exclusive school for boys, young boys. I don't think any of them were older than 3rd graders, 4th graders. And they all wore their uniforms, and they sat in the auditorium. That was early in the day, probably the assembly, at 9 o'clock in the morning. Then later on that day, I had booked Prabhupada to speak at the Wayside Chapel. So Prabhupada came to the boys' school. We always carried his Vyasasan with him. We always had a kirtan. There was a lot of brouhaha. And Prabhupada started off by asking the boys, what is consciousness? And one boy raised his hand. I forget what he said, but Prabhupada was so good with the kids. He asked the boy to come down. One boy raised, he asked him to come down. And his answer was a little off, but Prabhupada was very, very kind and gentle to him and sort of steered him in the right direction. And you know, he got the idea that consciousness is the spark of sensation from within the body and so on and so forth. And from there he went to discuss the supreme consciousness. In 13th chapter, Chitragnam Chapimam Vidi Sarva Chitra Shubharashu Sarva Chitra Jnanam Jnanas. There's the knower, and then there's the, there's the field, there's the proprietor and owner, the individual soul, the supreme soul. And it was a very technical lecture, but he presented it, it unfolded in a way that was perfectly palatable for these very, very young adolescent boys. And they were quite satisfied. And I had the feeling that they had really ingested most of what Prabhupada had to say. It was a very, very satisfying engagement. And there were a lot of kids there, as well as their teachers. Probably at least 200-300. Later on, we went to the Wayside Chapel in the evening. And Wayside Chapel, in spite of its name, chapel, was a gathering place for radicals, fanatics, homosexuals, Nazis. And the fellow who moderated all this was Reverend Ted Knopfs. And he delighted in sensationalism. You know, he wanted to get more and more people coming and make it a vortex of controversy and so on and so forth. And he probably saw himself as some sort of a catalyst or a midwife for wonderful new ideas. But because your constituency was the sediment of humanity, you know, the dregs, they were all very eloquent and well-spoken, but they were morally bankrupt and politically extreme. And Prabhupada came in and he gave a very brief and a very simple lecture. He just sensed that this was not a good forum, that each one of those persons was used to getting up and haranguing, and they were all building their own persona. And they weren't interested in surrender in any way, shape, and form. And so you could see Prabhupada just made the calculation, let's make this as brief and painless as possible. And compared to what he'd talked about in the morning with these adolescent boys, he spoke much more simply, as if they were, you know, less intellectual than the boys, which, of course, according to spiritual terms, they were. I mean, materially, they were, some of them, quite eloquent and articulate. But spiritually, they were totally unqualified. So Prabhupada spoke so simply and briefly. And then he opened up for questions, and the questions were all challenging. People like that don't ask questions, they make statements, they harangue. And I remember one person said, in a very elongated way, he said, da-da-da, blah, 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 mumbo-jumbo, chanting, da-da-da. What's the practical good of it? And I can hardly even give you any idea of the expression and the tone of Prabhupada's voice. He, in a completely disgusted way, he said, it saves you from death. He said it in a way that you wouldn't understand. But this is what it does. It's the practical result of chanting Hare Krishna and following is that it will save you from death. And as Reverend Knopf, after the program, as Reverend Knopf was escorting Prabhupada to the car, Prabhupada asked him, what do you do here? And Reverend Knopf said, well, one of the things we do is help kids with drugs. Prabhupada kind of registered that. And he got in the car, and then I believe Ugrashava was riding in the car with him, and Prabhupada said, so they give young people drugs?
Well, at one point, he used to have meetings with all the teachers, because at that time he was trying to give us some idea how to organize a Gurukul institution. So he would discuss not just the Gurukul but other things. And at one point he was discussing the Mayavadis and Vedanta. And he said that Vedanta, he said these big Mayavadis, Ram, Krishna, Vivekananda, he said they also study Vedanta and others. He said, but they could not understand. And then he posed it to us why they cannot understand. And so, again, he liked to put us on the spot to see what we could come up with. So one of the devotees cited that verse, Nahang Prakasya Sarvasya Yogamaya Savanvit, which is actually a good answer, that because of the Yogamaya, because of the illusory potency, they were bewildered. But he wasn't satisfied with that answer, and various answers were given. And finally, Dayananda sat bolt upright and said, because they haven't got Bhaktivedanta. And Prabhupada said, here's the answer. So all of us were feeling envious that Dayananda had been able to give such a great answer that Prabhupada was pleased by.
He was asked, have you ever seen Krishna? And he says, I always see Krishna in front of me. One time they asked, this boy was asking, have you ever seen, do you see God? And Prabhupada waited, because he was challenging for Prabhupada, but didn't answer. This was in public, at a pandal. It says, do you see God? And so Prabhupada hesitated a second time. Then Prabhupada said, yes. So Prabhupada understands his position. It's hard to describe, hard for us to estimate how he sees that everything is not done because of him, but when he's acting, he's the master of the art of his trade. He's the master of teaching Krishna consciousness. He knows precisely what he's doing. But he's very humble, because he knows that somehow it's just somehow or other to him, he says somehow or other, he has the mercy of his spiritual master. He liked him. My spiritual master liked me. That's Prabhupada's acknowledgement of his powers. My spiritual master liked me. I listened to his words very carefully. He took them very seriously. So that's his acknowledgement of how, somehow or other, miraculously, he's giving this credit.
Another time, Prabhupada was being interviewed by two young fellows, and they were, I forget what it was for, radio, television. There wasn't a camera, and there were two of them. I forget what it was all about. But they asked Prabhupada, have you seen God? Prabhupada said, what do you think? And Prabhupada said, if you go to buy gold, shouldn't you educate yourself first? What is gold? Then if someone says it's gold, you'll know. So you ask me, see God, how will you know? Whether you need to know who God is, what are the qualifications, then you'll know whether my answer is right or wrong. So do you know who God is, and do you know who's qualified to see Him? And they said, no. Then you have to accept whatever I say, because you don't know. So for better or worse, whatever I say you have to accept. And will you do that? Yes. Then I have seen God. So powerful.
On another occasion, I asked Prabhupada if I could bring a person who had been visiting us who had won the Teacher of the Year award in a nearby city. It was Fort Worth. I think he worked in Fort Worth. And he's a nice man. He and his wife had been coming pretty regularly to the temple, and I asked Prabhupada personally if I could bring them to see him. But when I went to bring them, and he gave me an appointment time, and then when I came back, on the way to his room, the teacher told me that he'd had a misfortune in his life, that he'd been driving a school bus and on Valentine's Day, and when the children got off at a certain stop, one of them, their card flew out of their hand. It went into the bus. He crawled into the bus, and he looked in both directions but didn't see anyone, and he ran over this child and killed them. So he was in distress, and he was thinking, how can I meet Prabhupada? I'm in such a state. I don't know if I can do this. And I said, well, just tell Prabhupada. And I wasn't sure that was the right thing, but anyway, as I immediately, when we got into the room, I told Prabhupada a little bit about the situation. And Prabhupada, I was just amazed by how compassionate. He he asked him about a half a dozen questions, very particular questions. Did you look both ways? And he got a whole sense of what had happened. And after questioning him at some length to find out the whole story, exactly what happened, what had been the reaction of the parents, what had been the reaction of the school, then he said, you will not be, how did he put it? He said, you will not be troubled in this. It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. And I don't remember the exact wording that he used, but basically he said, you will not be held to blame for this. So then this boy was completely pacified. And then he began to talk to Prabhupada and ask him different questions. And in the questions and answers, Prabhupada brought up this rocket scientist, Werner von Braun, that had gone before a scientific conference and declared that the real purpose of science was to establish the existence of God. And he'd said this to apparently a whole room full of scientists. And it caused consternation. But when Prabhupada read about it, he deputed some of his disciples to go and give him books and speak to him. So I got a little excited and I said, oh, Prabhupada, this is so wonderful. I said, he's such a famous person. If he becomes interested in Krishna consciousness, this will be a great boon for the movement. And Prabhupada just looked at me and said, I'm not interested in speaking to him because he's a famous man. He said, that's not my interest. He said, but because he's come to the right point, therefore I'm interested in speaking to him. And we could see this that throughout Prabhupada's preaching, if someone actually had some interest, whether they were low or high, big person or little person, he would spend sometimes hours with them just answering their questions and being merciful to them because of their sincere interest.
Another public speaking engagement I'd arranged for Prabhupada was in the Palais, which was a big hall out in St. Kilda, South Melbourne, not too far from the temple. And we always got good crowds. We'd put up posters and do good advertising. So Prabhupada gave many speaking programs in Paddington Town Hall, in Ormond Hall, he gave in Sydney Town Hall, he gave at the Palais. And they were all well attended. But the people who came and went weren't always completely happy because Prabhupada didn't fit their preconceptions. And I remember at the Palais, someone asked a long question about what Prabhupada thought of Guru Maharaji, who was very popular at the time in Australia. And Prabhupada never criticized anyone by name. He knew them, but he wouldn't just get right into it. He would be interested to see how they would represent the philosophy, and then he would respond to that. He wouldn't go personally in public against them. So he said, what is his philosophy? And the kids said that God is the light between your eyes. They had some system of pushing on the eyeballs until you saw stars, and that was supposed to be God. So this person said, God is the light between your eyes. Prabhupada just looked at that person. He said, thank you very much. And then someone asked about love saying rampant. Someone asked about Meher Baba. And Prabhupada said, what is their philosophy? And just didn't give any of them any credence at all. And people were complaining. People were, well, how come he's like that? And we just, well, that's our guru. Unalloyed devotional service, nothing less.
One summer, Srila Prabhupada was visiting with us, and it was very hot. So he wanted to go outside, and at that time, there was no garden, a nice spot for him to sit. So he went out and sat on the lawn in a chair on Graham Street, which is the busy street. And all these cars were zipping by, and Prabhupada was sitting out in the lawn in a chair with just a sannyas, what do you call that? The top, whatever, the sannyasi top. Someone was fanning him with a peacock fan. We were sitting out around Prabhupada, and this man walked by on the sidewalk. And when he saw Prabhupada, he just did a double take, and it was more than he could handle, because just after he looked, and then he walked by, and he just couldn't handle it, so he walked back, and in a very demanding voice, he said to Prabhupada, "Why is that man fanning you?" And Prabhupada, was just sitting very relaxed in the chair. And he just said, "It is hot." So this man he didn't know what to say. He just turned on his heel and walked off. So Prabhupada kind of demolished his whole irritation with 2 words, or 3 words. "It is hot." And that was it. So that was kind of a humorous.
I was fortunate enough to have arranged the program and sat through it. It's a St. Paschal's Seminary. I don't remember where that was in the environs of Melbourne or Sydney, but it was seminarians of the Franciscan order. We went to the seminary and we set up the Vyasa. Prabhupada gave a wonderful lecture about the universality of God consciousness. God consciousness is for everyone. Religious person is not necessarily Christian, Hindu, Muslim, or Jew, or one who pays lip service to this or that denomination, but one who follows the laws of God. Dharmam hi shakshad bhagavat panitam. And at the end, there was questions, and one of the seminarians asked, "What do you think of St. Francis?" And Prabhupada said, "What is his philosophy?" And he said, "Well, he talked about brother tree, sister bird." And Prabhupada, when he heard that, he said, "That is real God consciousness." And his appreciation was greater than theirs, and they were his followers. Prabhupada had never heard of St. Francis, and yet based on, a 2 or 3 sentence description of how St. Francis saw the world, Prabhupada immediately recognized that this was a kindred spirit, another guru, another spiritual master. And Prabhupada said, "That is real God consciousness." And I could see the seminarians were profoundly affected by that. And then, after the question period, Prabhupada said, "You have your name," and in ancient, whatever it was, Hebrew or whatever, the name of Christ was Christo. Christo, meaning, I think, the anointed one. And we have our name for God, which is Krishna. So let's join in glorifying God. You say Christo, and we'll say Krishna. And they stood up and they started. You say Krishna, 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 Krishna. And they had these frocked seminarians with their collars and all, young men, some of them bearded, a little older than us. We were in our early 20s. They were mostly probably mid or late 20s, early 30s. And then they had their older mentors there. And the place was rocking. And I noticed many of the seminarians had tears rolling down their faces. It was a very, very moving, completely ecumenic, non-denomination, non-sectarian glorification of God's names.
Giriraj and I both were talking to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada was also speaking about the different kendras and kala mandirs, these big halls in Delhi. They were like performance halls, cultural halls. There's a lot of them in Delhi. And as we were walking, we were just passing these one hall after the other, because our center was in the center of Delhi, and that's where all these halls were. And Prabhupada was saying how to organize and have programs there. And Giriraj asked Prabhupada a question. It was kind of a double conversation of how do we figure out how to spread this movement progressively. Prabhupada said, simply it takes intelligent organization. Again, a Prabhupada sutra, a mantra. Very simply it takes intelligent organization. So we can take that clue from Srila Prabhupada, that if we become serious in our hearts that we really want to see Lord Chaitanya's mission manifested, that as soon as possible, to its fullest degree, if we want to be some sort of facilitator for that and help, then we should intelligently organize.
On one occasion, at this particular time, this was 1976, I think. Harikesh, at that time the Gurukul was in a guest house room. We only had 4 or 5 kids. And Harikesh pulled me over to the side. He was at that time Prabhupada's secretary, and he said, "You're not running this Gurukula properly." He said, you should be like a guru figure to these children. You should be like the guru. You should not have such familiar relations, friendly, familiar relations. You should be like a guru." And I've never been all that submissive, so I said, "Well," I said, maybe that's your opinion." I said, "But as far as I know, Prabhupada never instructed us that way." And he'd instructed us a fair amount in Dallas, and I thought I had some idea what he expected. So I don't think that's... But anyway, he really getting on my case, you know, and I kind of felt this, didn't know what to think. And then I went on upstairs, and a few minutes later, somebody came pounding up the stairs, knocking at the door. "Prabhupada wants to see you right away." And I'd never been summoned before, so I was kind of sort of a little bit shocked. And the only thing I could think to do is check to make sure I had tilak on, because I knew that you didn't want to go before the spiritual master without tilak. So I ran down the stairs, came into Prabhupada's rooms, offered my dandavats, and just as I got up, Prabhupada was sitting behind his desk looking really, really grave, kind of like, you know, with the way his lips would turn down, kind of. He said, "So, you think you are guru?" I said, "What?" He said, "You think you are guru?" And I said, "Prabhupada, I never said that." And I was looking around the room desperately, and I saw Harikesh. I said, "He said that." So Prabhupada said, "What is this?" So then Harikesh was tempted to explain to Prabhupada, I guess, what his idea was. But after a couple of sentences, Prabhupada just waved him off. And then he looked back at me again. He said, "You are not guru." He said, "I am guru." I said, "I know." He went like this, you know, like, "Be quiet." He said, "You are the experienced disciple. You are teaching the inexperienced, but you are not guru. Is it clear?" And I said, "Yes, Prabhupada." "All right," he said, "all right then." And then he sort of dismissed me. So I walked out of the room completely crushed, thinking, what have I done? You know, I never thought that. Now I'm being chastised for it. And then years later, I kind of had the realization after we went through the period of difficulty, especially just after Prabhupada left, and where a lot of people were thinking that they were guru who maybe weren't so qualified, that I never had any illusions about what my situation was, at least. And that was kind of Prabhupada's mercy, that if I had any seeds of such desire, they were crushed from that one experience. So that made quite an impression on me.
On one morning walk somewhere in Sydney, Botanical Gardens or something, I had been curious about the power, the Shakti of the Kshatriyas. And I thought that based on our philosophy, having many wives and being active in that way we're supposed to preserve our powers and maintain continence, if not celibacy, to increase spiritual and physical power. Prabhupada said at one point that Gandhi was successful in driving the British out of India because he purportedly was continent after the age of 35. And so I asked Prabhupada, how is it that the Kshatriyas were most physically powerful people in society, and at the same time they were dispensing their seed, profusely? Prabhupada said, system of eating. That's all he said.
The devotees were talking to Prabhupada at the Kumbh Mela, and this devotee, Venkata Bhatta, told me this story, that this happened to him. He was asking Prabhupada about bathing at all these auspicious moments. He says, "Is this something that, as Vaishnavas, that we should do?" And he said, Prabhupada said, "Vaishnava?" He said, "You are trying to become Vaishnava." He said, "Vaishnava is not an ordinary thing." So, in other words, that here we were just at the stage of what Bhaktivedanta Thakur calls, I think, Vaishnava Praya, which means a near Vaishnava. We're trying to approach the precincts of becoming a Vaishnava, but we're thinking, we're there, we're Vaishnavas. Is this auspicious stuff? Do we? And he also told me that Prabhupada more or less indicated that you're thinking this is not for you. He said, but you need all the help you can get. but in so many words, you know, you need all the help you can get. So bathing in an auspicious moment, you know, go ahead.
And I remember too, and this was in a place that we'd gotten for Prabhupada in Paddington. Ugrashava was usually the one that would arrange the domiciles and the transportation. And so he'd gotten Prabhupada a place in Paddington. And a fellow came, he wanted to write a book or something about the Krishnas. And he wanted Prabhupada's permission to interview some of the disciples, see what their backgrounds were. And, you know, try to find some keys as to why certain types of people would come. Prabhupada said, you don't need to do that. And he said, well, why? And he said, because their backgrounds are all black. He said, it doesn't matter, they were a Nobel Prize winner, or PhD, or beggar on the street. Before they came to Krishna consciousness, it was all just black. He said, so don't pay any attention to what they were before. You know that verse, one who sees a Vaishnava as a member of a particular sect or creed, a spiritual master as an ordinary man, the deity is stone, has jada matir buddhi, has hellish consciousness. And so basically what this fellow was trying to do was to say, well, this is a Vaishnava as a BA, or this is a Vaishnava who took drugs, or this was a Vaishnava who worked for the Defense Department. You know, but Prabhupada was just saying, a Vaishnava is a Vaishnava. The example is given that sometimes the sky is clear all day long with no clouds. And so you get to 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you have a cloudless sky. On other days, you had clouds in the morning, but they dissipated. So you come to the same point in time, 5 o'clock, and it's a cloudless sky. So what difference does it make whether there had been clouds earlier in the day or whether there weren't clouds in the day? The point is, you've got a cloudless sky. So Prabhupada said, just see them as Vaishnavas. That's all. Don't see them in terms of where they came from, and or make relative determinations that this one was good and this one was bad. He said it was all bad. It was all black, whatever it was, all black. And now it's all white.
Well, Prabhupada used to sometimes come out and sit under the tamal tree in the courtyard. And he would sit under the tree and we would perform kirtan or bhajan. And it was kind of like an honor to be able to chant, you know, just for Prabhupada's pleasure. So this one devotee, maybe I shouldn't mention names, but anyway, this one devotee who was very flamboyant, he used to have his dhotis and his very elaborate style with his, every mark of tilak was absolutely perfect, and he wore silk, and he was just like a, you know, obviously very caught up, and he considered himself to be a very expert kirtaniya. And so he began to chant in this kind of very showy way. And Prabhupada listened to it for a few seconds, and then he just waved him off, and he pointed to one of the Gurukula boys. Now the boy that he pointed to could not sing. I mean, he had a voice like a strangled frog. I mean, it was the worst voice you could imagine. And he didn't have much of a clue how to play mridanga either. But Prabhupada asked him to chant. So this boy began wailing away on the mridanga, and as he was singing, his face went bright red, and you could see total sincerity in the effort, but the sound was atrocious. And Prabhupada was sitting there smiling and nodding his head and tapping his finger, and he was obviously enjoying it. And this other devotee got so upset, he actually got up and left. He couldn't handle it. But Prabhupada was appreciating that this boy is chanting completely from his heart, and this other chanting is kind of a show. So he didn't have much appreciation for show bottle.
On different occasions, I've been in the room with Prabhupada, and Prabhupada talked about change. In general, he says that is your whole disease, that you want to change everything. He talked about how they changed things in Los Angeles, how they had taken down the glass windows, and he didn't want that. And Prabhupada would constantly give instructions, and devotees would change them. At the same time, there were things that Prabhupada wanted changed. So it's a matter of understanding more completely that he did ask people, say, as the editors, to change his words. One that kept coming up quite a few times, and it took him a long time to change it, in the Gita, for instance, was that they kept on, instead of Krishi Gorakshika Vanajam, they had Harigriva had put it, Prabhupada once joked, Bhagavad Gita as it is not. That Harigriva had written, compiled Bhagavad Gita as it is not. So there were many mistakes in the revised edition that needed correcting. One was the cattle raising. And Prabhupada, sometimes he'd get angry about it because it would annoy him that they would use such a term. He says, I've said before, cow protection, why have you not changed it? So there were things that he would instruct and change, and you weren't supposed to change that. And he also gave instructions on who should change it and review things. But in general, it was the overall disease. So one shouldn't take that and abuse it in terms of those who were authorized to make changes, and those who are even authorized, they should make it appropriate. But overall, it's better safe than sorry. If something was like that, don't change it. Like kirtan. Although I was not present for this particular incident, I was present for those other incidents in kirtans. And for instance, in the beginning, Prabhupada would do kirtan, and at the end of chanting Hare Krishna, he would just stop. And then they started introducing the Hari Bol from the Gaudiya Math. And Prabhupada said, what is this Hari Bol? Do Hari Bol. Or the Jaya Jaya Gurudev. Prabhupada said, which Gurudev? And I heard him tangentially say this, but wasn't at a kirtan when he said it. But I know devotees who were very careful in what they repeated. One of Prabhupada's pet peeves was, Prabhupada said. He said, who said? Prabhupada said. And with Rameshwar related it to me, and it's also in the recorded conversation. Prabhupada says, that is your problem. You're always saying, Prabhupada said, stop this. It became a real problem. Who said Prabhupada said? When did I say? I never said.
He was sitting behind a desk when he first came into the room. He was going to show us how to teach. So he came in, and when he first walked into the room, there was nothing for him to sit on. So he was just standing there. So somebody ran to the temple and got a large seat and put it down behind his desk. Prabhupada sat down. And then he said, so what are your questions? So then people began to ask questions, but some of the questions were coming from a position just to the side, almost behind Prabhupada. He said, no. You come to the front, then you ask. So he made them come from where they were sitting, got them to move, come up and sit in front of him to ask the question. Later on, I read in Manu that this is the etiquette, that when you sit before the spiritual master or the guru, you must sit never to the side or to the back of him, but always come and sit in the front and humbly put your questions. So this has been a long time ago, so I can't remember many of the specific questions, but I remember at one point he asked for some sticks, and he held up 2 sticks, and he said, all right, he said, this one is for the students if they misbehave. And he went like that, so people were stretching their hands out, and he said, and the other one is for the teachers if they misbehave. Of course, that instruction wasn't very well understood, unfortunately.
I was on one morning walk with Prabhupada where he was told that 2 ladies, Swati and Shasti, I think they were. They might have been in Oregon.
Shasti and Swati.
Yeah. They had observed Ekadasi for a year, every day. Only eating fruits, not eating grains for a year. Prabhupada said, that is very good. He said, grains are for animals. Then a month later, I was on another morning walk with Prabhupada, and I don't know where the first one was, but the second one was in Vrindavan. And Prabhupada was talking something about grains building strength. And one devotee said, but Prabhupada, I thought you said grains were for animals. Prabhupada said, I eat grains. Am I an animal?
Another time during this period, the Bhagaji was Prabhupada's friend who was kind of helping with the management of Vrindavan. And he used to go in pretty regularly to see Prabhupada. Prabhupada liked to associate with him because one thing, Bhagaji always told jokes. And of course, most of them were, I think, in Hindi. I didn't understand them, but they had quite a friendly relationship. And Bhagaji was kind of like the patron of the Gurukul at that time. He had arranged for the land and so many things. So one day he was going in and I said, "Can I come with you?" You know, and I was thinking, well, I mean, I am kind of running this little fledgling Gurukul, and maybe I could go in too. Because, you know, you were kind of afraid to even try to get in to see Prabhupada because, as someone was pointing out in some of the classes here, that it's like there was a wall of sannyasis and, you know, older devotees that kind of were a little bit intimidating. So he said, "Yes, you come. So I went in with Bhagaji, and he went in to see Prabhupada, and they greeted each other, and Prabhupada had a couple of Indian guests sitting there with him out in the garden where they had the lotus fountain. And as soon as Prabhupada spotted me, he pointed to me and he said, go and get an asana." Or no, he didn't. He said, "Go and get some asanas." So I thought, oh my gosh. So I ran back out. I found Harisari. I said, "Prabhupada wants some asanas." And Harisari said, "I don't think we have any." So then he began rummaging around in a closet, and he found this one kind of rumpled, not terrible looking, you know, asana. He said, "This is all I've got." So he gave it to me. So already I was in a sweat because I was, you know, not getting anywhere. So I went back out with my asana. Prabhupada spotted me again. I mean, as soon as I walked into that garden, immediately he said, "Get them some prasadam," because these guests were just getting up to leave. So, "Yes, Prabhupada." So I ran in. "Prabhupada wants prasadam for these guests." He said, "It's right over there on the table." So then they came out. I handed them the prasadam, and I did something right, you know. And I went back out to the garden again, and I was just kind of standing there in the back with my one crumpled asana. And Prabhupada looked up at me again. As soon as I came in, he looked at me and said, "So?" He said, "I've several times asked you to get some asanas. What is the difficulty?" I said, "Prabhupada, they only have this one asana." And he just looked at me kind of like. And then I, like an idiot, you know, sometimes when you're destined to make an idiot of yourself, I said, "Prabhupada, what should I do with this asana?" He said, "Take your one asana and sit down." And then he began to laugh uproariously, and he and Bhagaji were laughing. And he said something to the effect, I caught the drift of it. It was something to the effect of, "These Westerners, what can you do?" You know? When they were laughing like uproariously, and I was the object of the laughter, but somehow I started laughing uproariously, because somehow it struck me as completely funny that I'd gone in there with aspirations to be recognized as one of the big devotees. And Prabhupada just crushed me completely, and it made me realize, you know, I'm just, you know, an insignificant servant, and I can hardly do anything right. You know, it was just my whole ego was immediately reduced to its proper perspective. So it was quite an instructive experience as far as false ego goes. On another occasion, Prabhupada was circumambulating the temple, and there was a group of us. I can't remember whether at the beginning or the end of a walk. I think it was at the beginning of a walk, but he was circumambulating the temple. And at one point, when he came to the corner of the building, he stopped very suddenly, and the devotees almost ran into him. And he turned around, and he just said in a very grave voice, he said, "You are blind, but I can see." And so, you know, we didn't know. Yeah, of course. You know, we didn't know what to say. Nobody said anything. So then we went around again. And when we got back to the same spot, without saying anything, he just pointed to a light that was on. Now the sun had already come up, and the light was burning. Now his mood in Vrindavan was that none of pice should be wasted. So whenever any water was dripping, whenever there was any neglect, whenever there was any kind of, you know, merchant trying to get the better of us in some business deal, he was on top of it. And that was his comment. "I am blind. You are blind, but I can see." So it kind of worked on every level. You know, it was true in terms of the management of that temple. It was true in terms of our spiritual condition. It was a statement in truth, but it had a practical application.
In one of the letters I received from Prabhupada, was another instruction. It's typical of how Prabhupada gave instructions. He said, now strain your brain to think of ways to more and more ways. Now strain your brain to think of more and more ways to introduce my books to the intelligent class of men. And just the way Prabhupada would deal, just talking about letters. And then I'll talk about family. So talking about letters, Prabhupada was dealing with me simply by letters. I was alone in Delhi, really alone. No one would stay, and in the beginning there was no one even coming there except to make trouble. And I had to endure all of that. And I was always in anxiety. That's a whole other thing about anxiety and Krishna consciousness. So I was writing to Prabhupada and giving him reports, and he always wanted me to write to him. He said, I always want to hear from you, and it was very encouraging. And I had made 10 members of parliament into life members. And Prabhupada writes back, you have opened up a whole new history in Krishna consciousness. He's like, wow, I just made 10 members of parliament to life members, you know. But Prabhupada writes, you have opened up a whole new chapter in the history of Krishna consciousness movement. I mean, it's like this was earth-shattering news. Like, you know, Prabhupada's gone to the spiritual world. They just made 10 life members. I mean, this is the way he wrote it. You know, you could actually see here. I said, wait a minute, Prabhupada, I only made 10, you know. Prabhupada, I made 10 life members. I don't even need to tell you that. I don't want to hear it. But at the same time, you know, Prabhupada was so sweet and encouraging. And actually, he felt that. We had such a good time planning and scheming about members of parliament, and it was becoming amazing what was going on, you know, by Prabhupada's mercy. And the biggest members of parliament, the hardest to crack, were people who were, you know, even Mayavadis. They were inviting Prabhupada, and Kamalapati Tripati, who was next to Indira Gandhi in the Congress party, most respected. He was called Pandaji. He invited Prabhupada to his house, had a public program where he invited all the ministers and top members of parliament to his house. I mean, this was like, and Prabhupada was like on fire going to that program, talking about Rupa Goswami, Sanatana Goswami.
Another occasion after a lecture, Gyanagamya stood up, a friend of mine, and he asked Prabhupada, how can we ever repay our debt to you? And Prabhupada said, you can never repay your debt. He said, remain always indebted. So that was his response. And on another occasion, after he'd given a Bhagavad Gita lecture, this Indian man from the back of the temple room got up and said, I don't think he actually got up, he was just asking his question from the back of the room. And his question was something to the effect of, why was Krishna trying to tempt Arjuna to fight? Now actually this is, amongst many so-called religions, this is a very commonly asked question, apparently. Because I've read since then that this is one of the challenges. Why was Krishna trying to agitate Arjuna into becoming violent? This seems to go against the principle of humility and peacefulness, etc., etc. So he was challenging, why was Krishna tempting Arjuna? And Prabhupada got kind of fiery and looked really irritated, and he said, come up here. Just like the way maybe like a grandfather would speak to his grandson who was really out of line. Come up here, he said. And he motioned that this person should get up. And this person, as they came up towards the front to sit, you know, just like kind of like in the classroom, to sit just in front of Prabhupada, he put him in the position of a student. And he said, now repeat your question. So by this time, the man was already quite diminished in his challenging attitude. And he kind of stammered it out again. And then Prabhupada began to roar at him. And he said, I can't remember, I wish I could remember the exact words, but it was something to the effect of, do you think that Krishna, the Supreme Being, who is all compassionate, would try to get Arjuna to do something that was against religious principles? When Krishna is Dharman tu sakshat bhagavat pranam, Krishna is the origin of all religious principles, that he would advise Arjuna to do something against his own self-interest? And he just was hammering this guy. And then when he got through, he just went like this. He just kind of discarded him, you know, with a wave of his hand. And the man kind of almost crawled back to his original position. But apparently that's what he thought that person needed at that instant.
Another occasion, I also asked him in a lecture, at the end of lecture, I said, if Christians would give up eating meat, would they be Krishna conscious? He said, yes, definitely. Krishna is pure, you become pure, you will understand, Krishna will be revealed to you if you're pure.
On one occasion, Prabhupada was asked, after he gave a lecture, I'm trying to remember the question. It went something to the effect of, what is it like to be always in touch with God? In other words, what is it like to be situated in God consciousness? So Prabhupada kind of pondered the question for a few seconds. And then he just answered, he said, without fear. And then he just smiled, like one of these gargantuan smiles. And without trying to hyperbolize the situation, I started grinning like an idiot, and I felt ecstasy. And the hairs on my arms were standing up on end, and I was feeling really emotional, and I thought, boy, I don't want to make an idiot out of myself, you know. But I looked around the room, and everybody else was in the same kind of state. This sort of wave of ecstatic feeling went through the room. And for that moment, nobody had any fear. It was, I can't prove that, what's the word, scientifically, but it was like there was a moment where everybody had symptoms of ecstasy. And then later on I read in Chaitanya Shikshamrita that when someone's on the Uttama Adhikari platform, by their association, you can experience symptoms of bhava. Just briefly, by their grace, by their association. So that it was like a moment of ecstasy for everyone where they felt no fear.
So then I wrote another letter to Prabhupada that it was really an anxiety. Something else had happened, someone else came, and that didn't help it. And you know, the people who I asked to help abandoned me. The people would stay there 3 weeks, and then they'd run away, so I would train someone, and that was very disheartening. My wife would argue and run away. So I wrote another letter, and then Prabhupada's reply was about that. He said, actually, we are not after making members, we're not after collections, we're not after selling these books, we're not after any of these things. These are just different ways to engage the devotees in service to Krishna and thus become Krishna conscious. He says, so you need not worry. Do not be in anxiety. But 2 weeks later, I get a letter from Srila Prabhupada increasing my responsibilities by 5-fold, where he told me make members of parliament and this and this. So it's hard to understand that relationship. And then things kept on getting more and more anxious. There were so many responsibilities. I had been out 45 days without making a member. So I was in a lot of anxiety, and Prabhupada came. And I was thinking about this. Why am I in anxiety? And I was trying to follow Prabhupada's instructions of being detached, just thinking I'm a servant of Krishna. And whatever I get, Krishna comes. But every day I'd still be faced with the reality there were devotees in Vrindavan, and if I didn't send money, they'd starve. And there were devotees in Delhi, and I had to take care of them. And, you know, Prabhupada put me under very stringent controls. I had to give 50% of life membership to BBT and 50% to construction. You don't have to be more than in second grade, you know. 100 minus 50 is 50, and 50 minus 50 is 0. So I had a sum of 0 for maintenance. And I was the maintainer, the little maintainer of Vrindavan and Delhi. So I had no way, in terms of ordinary way, of getting maintenance. So it was quite an anxious thing. And there were always problems and more things to do. No prasadam. Everyone ate my prasadam. I was sick, and people went against me, and there were revolutions. So it was a lot of anxiety. You know? So I went to Srila Prabhupada. He was taking his massage, which he would do every afternoon, very leisurely. Despite that he had so many things to do. He was very leisurely about everything he did. So I went to him, and I was just sitting there for a while. It took an hour for his massage, and I sat there for a while. So I told Srila Prabhupada, in my mind, I have a worry about something. I'm worried that I'm not progressing in my spiritual life correctly. Because it says in Bhagavad Gita, Brahma-bhuta prasannatma na sochati na kankshati. That when one goes to the Brahma-bhuta platform, or is in Krishna consciousness, that anxiety and lamentation are gone. I said, so I'm not concerned in terms of what I'm getting, but I'm just always anxiety. And I'm concerned that I'm making an error in my spiritual life, and that's causing the anxiety. So, Srila Prabhupada, please correct me. This was Prabhupada's reply. It's so amazing. You want to take an amazing incident. Prabhupada looked at me. He was looking at me so softly and kindly. He says, no. He says, your anxiety is all about pleasing Krishna. Then he said, and Mother Yasoda, you see, she is always in anxiety. That this demon Trinavarta might steal Krishna, or that Krishna might be hungry. Mother Yasoda is always in anxiety. He says, so like that, all your anxieties are simply in relationship to pleasing Krishna. So they are transcendental. So kind, huh?
This was in Vrindavan. The Gurukul building was under construction. I probably would like to go over there every couple of days to see how it was progressing. So they went to the back of the building where all the workers were out there in the early morning, and he had a whole contingent of sannyasis and senior devotees with him. And they were looking out the back windows there at the workers, and they were out there. Some of them were bathing under there was a pipe with water gushing out, and they were bathing. And some of them were on fires, were making chapatis. Some of them were brushing their teeth with neem twigs. They were chanting. They were Brijbasis, a lot of them, so they were chanting songs about Krishna. And Prabhupada was just watching this whole scene and appreciating it. And finally he turned around and he said, just see. He said, they will rise early in the morning. They will work all day long. For what? He said, somebody said 3 rupees. For a few rupees, he said, they will work all day long in the hot sun. They will take bath. They will chant some mantra. He said, they will live in this simple way. He said, and then he was just kind of really appreciating how the simplicity of their life and how sincere and innocent they were. And then Hansaduta Maharaj said, Prabhupada, we should learn to live like this. And Prabhupada just began to laugh, and he said, you will never learn. You will never learn.
Prabhupada came, he sat on the Vyasa-san, and the first question, right, bang, was, the reporter asked, so what's going to happen to the movement after you die? And before the words were even out of his mouth, he hadn't even finished his sentence, Prabhupada said, I will never die. Long pause. I will live forever in my books. I remember also Prabhupada going back to Australia. When Prabhupada would arrive, I would always make sure all the press knew about it, and they were quite responsive. They would show up at the airport and follow him to the temple. It was always a media event when Prabhupada arrived. And one occasion, Prabhupada arrived, and the reporter spent quite a bit of time with him. He was a reporter for the Melbourne Age, which is the largest daily newspaper in Melbourne. And Prabhupada would always, he would treat them as individuals. He wasn't giving a media package, something slick for reproduction in the papers. He was trying to get them to be Krishna conscious. And Prabhupada spent a lot of time, and I was there, and he really, really, really gave this fellow a lot of mercy. And then the article that came out the next day had a picture of him. It said, Swami says he'll be an animal in his next life. And we were just aghast at the ingratitude and the dullness of this fellow. And we came and we were upset, and we showed the article. Look what he's written after all. And Prabhupada just smiled. And he asked me, he said, Caru, he said, count the number of times that Krishna is mentioned in the article. I don't know what it was, 8 or 10 times. And he said, what is the circulation? I don't remember, 500,000, maybe not that many, 200,000 or 300,000. How many people read it? And then we figured, and then we came up with a figure, 500, 600, 700,000 times the number of, so it turned out that the name of Krishna was repeated or read more than 1 million times as a result of that article. So he said, how can that be bad? The name of Krishna has been intoned mentally and verbally more than 1 million times on this day. So that cannot be bad.
Another time when he was circumambulating the temple, he came to originally they had used some kind of red stone that went around the parikram path, around the Krishna Balaram Mandir. And it was laid out in a particular pattern, but when it came to this one particular area where there was a curve, it was kind of a strange-looking arrangement of stone. And Prabhupada pointed to it with his cane and said, "What is this?" He said, "This is not a proper pattern." He said, "They have cheated you. They have given you the rejected stone. And they have charged you according to the rate for, the good stone. You've been cheated." Then Harikesh, well, this is the rasa that Harikesh had with Prabhupada. He would either try to correct or argue with Prabhupada. And everybody was always like kind of wondering, what's he going to say now? So he began to give an argument to Prabhupada. No, Prabhupada, actually it is a pattern. And he launched into a complex explanation of how it was actually a pattern. And so Prabhupada said, it's not a pattern. It's obvious it's not a pattern. And they were going back and forth. Finally, Prabhupada yelled at him. He said, "Yes," he said, "it is a pattern. It is a clown's pattern." And said, "And you are the fool." And then Harikesh began to laugh hysterically. And everybody was just kind of in awe that this person would have the nerve to argue with Prabhupada about something like this. But that seemed to be the nature of their relationship. But I just remember, yes, it is a pattern. It is a clown's pattern.
Prabhupada, the whole temple room in the Lotus building was packed, and Prabhupada was giving the lecture. And he said, he just had a moment there when he looked out on all these young kids, 20 years old, and he said, you got a sense of how exciting every day was for him, preaching Krishna consciousness, captaining a world movement, and exciting for all of us who participate in it. And so Prabhupada, he just said, "I am an old man." He said, "I may go any time." He said, "But there are hundreds of you, and you're young men, and all of you have at least 50 years left." And he was transcendently envious of us, that he was going to have to go, and we all had 50 years. And he just started crying out of sheer enthusiasm to preach.
Like Shayananda Maharaj was in the room with Prabhupada, and Prabhupada was discussing various plans, preaching plans. And then he said, "So, what should we do?" And Akshayananda Maharaj replied, "Prabhupada, we'll just have to become Krishna conscious." And Prabhupada said, "Another impractical suggestion." That story kind of made the rounds in Vrindavan at the time, and I just always thought that was one of the most hilarious. Oh, and that these are just story. For instance, that story that the devotee was saying, "Oh, he was the most fallen." You know this one? "I'm the most fallen, Prabhupada." And Prabhupada said, "You're not the most anything." That's it. I mean, this devotee was lamenting, like trying to show how humble he was, and he said, "Prabhupada, I'm the most fallen." And Prabhupada said, "You're not the most anything." It's kind of like wanting credit for being the most something. And Prabhupada said, "You're not the most anything." That always struck me. But that's what I mean. It was so quick. And it was so funny. It was so sharp and very sarcastic, but you never felt offended when he did it. Even if it was at your expense, it was funny, you had to admit it was really funny. And it always had an instructive edge to it. I think that was the other part that was so nice, that it was merciful. Because he was trying to help you. The false ego is such an obstacle. And he was trying to cut through that and make us try to get more in touch with reality.
Before Prabhupada first personally came to visit us in Australia, we had a couple of his books. We had the Bhagavad Gita. I don't know if we had the Krishna book, but we knew something of him as an author, and one always tends to think of the author as a person and then his works as being two separate things. I mean, this is his work, and then one is curious to know what the person's like. You read a modern author, John Grisham, and say, okay, that's what he wrote, that's his fiction or fantasy, and what's the fellow like? And so I had wondered what would Prabhupada be like in person, having read his commentaries and so on and so forth. And first time Prabhupada came to Australia, he stayed, I think it was only 4 days. And I was in charge at that time. Later Mohananda came and Madhavisa came, but I think the first time it was pretty much just me. And I was with him more than anybody. And it didn't matter whether I was in the room with him alone or whether there were 20 or 30 people. He was personification of the Bhagavatam and the Gita. There wasn't any difference between his work and himself. He was truly the person Bhagavat. And I think I had, very early on, the realization that one needn't be in the physical presence of Prabhupada. Because Prabhupada is perfectly and completely present in his books, and there is no difference between Prabhupada and his books. And so I always had plenty of inspiration, in my devotional life, because I never had a problem with that. I mean, Prabhupada leaving the planet was the worst day of my life. But still, everything was still there. Everything was still there. The books, the senior devotees, our international society, our vision, our goal, our inspiration. And to this day, I haven't faltered for any lack of inspiration.
This is Vrindavan. Srila Prabhupada departed from Vrindavan on November 14th, 1977. This was approximately November 8th or November 10th. So I came to Vrindavan. I was in the Hyderabad farm, which was very important to Srila Prabhupada, so I was staying there. But I heard that Srila Prabhupada was not feeling well and that it was a chance he might leave the world, so I went to see him. And came there, and I tried to be as inconspicuous as possible, not to disrupt the mood. The room was packed with devotees. Everyone was very quiet, and I could see Prabhupada's condition. I was told about it. He really hadn't eaten for almost 6 months. It's a very important thing to understand Prabhupada's condition. He was lying in bed, emaciated, weighing maybe 70 pounds, if that much, drinking 1 spoon, 2 spoons of water, maybe eating a little bit. And as I was sitting there in the back, just listening to what was going on, and there was some kirtan. Kirtananda had come in and was offering Srila Prabhupada some strawberries, probably from New Vrindavan. So Srila Prabhupada asked, when Kirtananda offered him the strawberries, he says, "What is the value of strawberries?" And everyone was silent. And no one knew what to say. So then several devotees kept on poking me. I'm kind of known as the walking encyclopedia. I like to study things. So they kept on poking me to say something. So I didn't want to intrude on Prabhupada. I was remaining quiet. But I spoke. I said, "Srila Prabhupada, the value of strawberries is that they're very high in fructose, and that provides immediate energy." Because I knew Prabhupada wasn't so much into vitamins. So I talked about the value. Prabhupada's very pragmatic. Even lying on his departure bed, not eating, he's concerned what will be the value of eating it. Pragmatic person. So the devotee next to him says, "Tejiyas says that it," and he repeated it. And Prabhupada said, "Oh, Tejiyas is here." And Prabhupada said, "How is the Hyderabad farm?" So he's so cognizant, always. I mean, even this state. And so I gave him a report that we're growing corn, rice, mung beans, like that. And as soon as I said corn, Prabhupada said, "Oh." He says, "Corn. You can grind the corn, and then there are big pieces, which you can boil with water, cook with water, like rice, which is called bhat. And the other, the fine powder, you make that together like a roti, and you cook that on the pan, the cooking pan." And he says, and the villagers, they very much like this. So here he was, from a physical point of view, starving. And what was he thinking? He was just thinking how we could make this corn in the most delicious way to make the villagers happy when they take prasadam. This is a person of unlimited compassion.
In Prabhupada's last days, we used to go in shifts, 24-hour kirtan was going on in his room, and we used to go in shifts. And I used to go in sometimes with a group of Gurukul students, and we would chant. I don't remember what our shift was. It was an hour or 2 hours. But we would chant using these very tiny cartels, making as little noise as possible because Prabhupada couldn't take too much sound, and they kept the lights quite low. And so Tamal Krishna Maharaj, as I remember, asked me to chant, to lead the chanting. So I began to chant, and I was thinking, I'd really like to please Prabhupada with this chanting. And so I tried to remember every tune that I'd ever heard him chant Hare Krishna mantra with. I didn't know that many, but I tried to make sure they were tunes that he chanted. So I was really concentrating, and I was chanting these different tunes. And then our shift was over, and we got up and went out. Well, the next day when we went to chant, Tamal Krishna Maharaj grabbed me by the arm and said, "You have to chant for Prabhupada." And I said, "Why? You know, I mean, oh, sure, but..." He said, the other day when you were chanting, he said Prabhupada had called him over after we left and said, "Who was that chanting?" And Tamal, always like the guardian, said, "Was there anything wrong, Prabhupada?" And Prabhupada said, "No." He said, "It was nice. It was very nice," he said. So that was one. And then on another occasion, Ayodhyapati, who is now P.B. Govinda Maharaj, I don't know his sannyas name. Anyway, his name at that time was Ayodhyapati. And I were in Prabhupada's room, and they asked us if we would like to help massage Prabhupada. And so people were massaging somebody was massaging the head, some people were massaging the arms, legs, and Ayodhyapati and I each had one foot. And so we were massaging Prabhupada's feet. And I was feeling like I've always wanted to get the dust from Prabhupada's feet. And I never had the opportunity, and we were always worried about doing it anyway because, you know, it was a little bit discouraged. And so we each had one foot. And I turned to Ayodhyapati, and I only know this because he told me. I hadn't remembered this till he told me. I turned to him and I said, "This is Vaikuntha." I said, and it was like, we just felt like we were in the spiritual world, you know, with Prabhupada, just massaging his feet and, you know, just doing that as a service. It was real nice. And of course, I was also there when Prabhupada disappeared, left this world. And I'm sure you've probably heard plenty of stories from the devotees that were there. My own feeling at the time, it was just such a feeling of helplessness and desperation because, in fact, it was like that a lot during the last couple of months because it just felt like it was inevitable, but you couldn't stand the thought that he wasn't going to be with us. And on that last day, everyone was chanting. At first there was a kind of a back and forth, and then everybody began chanting together in the last moments. And again, it's not something you can empirically establish, but it felt like there were many more people in that room than were actually there. It felt like there was a heavenly chorus. It felt like there must be so many other personalities from other places who were present. And there was this tremendous feeling. I'm not trying to make light of it. It was like a Technicolor finish. You know, like when you have this spectacular ending to a movie or something. It was like this glorious chanting was going on, and Prabhupada was, with his last breath, was Hare Krishna, you know, uttering the syllables Hare Krishna, and you could almost feel the ascent. You know, it was like you sensed, okay, he's ascending now, he's with Krishna. And the emotions were so intense in the room, and some devotees became completely hysterical, crying. One devotee threw himself on the floor and just weeping, he couldn't control himself. Other people were completely stricken or stoic, or there were so many different kinds of reactions. But it was a very intense moment. But there was nothing inauspicious about it. It was completely auspicious. And sometimes they describe the sentiments of the gopis as being simultaneous nectar and poison. It was kind of like that. It was ecstatic because you knew that Prabhupada had perfectly executed the mission of human life and was back to Godhead. And but for us, it was loss, irretrievable and irreplaceable loss. So it was a very difficult period.
Jai